All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really profound topic, the inherited wound and the true human cost of partition.
Usually when people bring up 1947 in South Asia, the conversation immediately goes to independence, right? Flags being raised at midnight, historic speeches. But to actually understand the reality of what happened on the ground, I want you to picture a very specific scene. Imagine the single family sitting on a hard wooden bench inside a train leaving Punjab in August of 1947. They're surrounded by these hastily tied bundles of clothes, maybe a few cooking pots, some blankets, a couple of photographs. Everything they own in the entire world has literally been reduced to what they can physically carry in their arms. A mother is holding her kids close, the father is just staring out the window. They're heading into a completely unknown future. They don't even know where they're going to sleep tomorrow night. And right outside their window, another train goes rushing past in the exact opposite direction, carrying another family facing that exact same terrifying unknown.
Now, let's zoom out from that single family for a second to look at the sheer, mind-boggling scale of this crisis. 10 million. In just 6 weeks, 10 million people were displaced. We are talking about the largest forced migration in human history, with people crossing newly created borders at a speed that almost defies comprehension. And tragically, roughly 2 million people would die in the process. Entire cities were just transformed overnight, and communities simply vanished.
So, how did we even get here? Well, by 1940, the British Empire was heavily weakened by war and debt, and it became pretty clear that their rule in India was coming to an end. The massive question was, what exactly would replace it? And this uncertainty gave rise to the two-nation theory. Adopted by the Muslim League in 1940, this concept argued that Muslims and Hindus were fundamentally distinct political communities, and because of that, they required completely separate states to guarantee their interests.
This basically created a massive, tragic deadlock. On one hand, you had the Muslim League, and their fears were really rooted in democratic math. I mean, if power is determined by population size, what happens to a minority group decades down the line? They were terrified of becoming a permanent minority without any real political guarantees. But on the other side, leaders within the Indian National Congress firmly believed a united country was still absolutely possible. They warned that trying to carve up lands where people, languages, and cultures had overlapped for literally centuries would ignite the exact existential conflict it was supposedly trying to prevent. So you have both sides desperately trying to avoid a disaster, yet both completely convinced that the other's solution would cause one. Then, this ideological debate suddenly turns into an absolute administrative nightmare. In March 1947, Lord Louis Mountbatten was appointed as the last viceroy to oversee the transfer of power. Now, pay attention to the original target date here, June 1948. That was supposed to give everyone time to negotiate and actually organize things. But Mountbatten makes a decision that changes millions of lives. He moves the date all the way forward to August 1947. Just like that, 10 vital months of preparation vanished almost overnight.
Moving a date up on a calendar might look like a simple administrative tweak, right? But on the ground, it was absolutely catastrophic. Because of this incredibly rushed timeline, armies and police forces simply could not be reorganized or redeployed in time to keep the peace. There were no refugee plans created, emergency supply systems were completely unbuilt, millions of civilians suddenly woke up not knowing where they belonged, and honestly, perhaps most incredibly of all, the new borders they were supposed to cross didn't even exist yet.
And that brings us to Cyril Radcliffe, the man actually hired to draw those missing borders. The staggering absurdity of his situation is just hard to overstate. Radcliffe was a highly respected, very intelligent lawyer from London, but he was given only 5 weeks to divide the entire subcontinent. And get this, the most shocking detail is that he was chosen specifically because he knew absolutely nothing about India. The British somehow believed this made him impartial. He had literally never set foot there before taking this assignment, not once.
I mean, just imagine being handed a stack of maps and some old census data, and being told to draw a line straight through communities that had evolved together over hundreds of years. Think about a majority Muslim village connected by a railway to a majority Sikh village, and both of them are sharing an irrigation canal with a mixed town. They shared factories, they shared local economies. Can you imagine the utter impossibility of trying to cleanly separate these deeply, deeply intertwined human lives with a single pen stroke?
Yeah, so the deeper Radcliffe looked, the more utterly impossible the whole thing became. Every single line he drew fixed one political problem, but then it instantly, violently created another human one. Rivers and essential railways crisscrossed his new boundaries. Local markets were suddenly cut cleanly in half. Families found themselves split across these arbitrary lines, and some villages were literally torn apart. Like someone's actual house ended up on one side of a brand new country, and the fields their family farmed ended up in another.
So, as August rolls around, people are desperately waiting for answers. But the answers just didn't come in time. On August 14th, Pakistan was officially born. On August 15th, India became independent. There were all these huge celebrations, flags waving, historic speeches. But millions of people literally had no idea which country they were actually standing in. That's because the terrifying new boundary, the Radcliffe Line, wasn't even published until August 17th, 2 whole days after independence. And that is when the panic truly began.
And Radcliffe himself, well, he was so shaken by the sheer impossibility and horror of what he had just been forced to do that he actually burned all of his notes and papers. He flat out refused his fee for the job, and he left the subcontinent immediately. For the rest of his entire life, he never publicly discussed what happened. And you know, in history, sometimes complete silence tells you way more than words ever could.
What followed the announcement of those borders shocked literally everyone, even the people who had anticipated some violence. The region of Punjab became the epicenter of a total societal collapse. And the trains, those very same trains that were moving desperately fleeing refugees, they became these horrific rolling symbols of the tragedy. They pull into stations packed with people fleeing the violence. Sometimes they arrived with survivors, sure, but other times they arrived completely filled with the dead, men, women, and children. They basically became these horrific human messages of hatred and revenge being sent back and forth across the border, signaling to everyone that the world they used to know was gone forever.
The violence seeped into the most intimate parts of people's lives. It's estimated that 75,000 women, Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh, were abducted or assaulted during this utter chaos. The fear was so profound, so absolute, that in some parts of Punjab, terrified families tragically took the lives of their own daughters rather than risk what they believed was waiting for them if they were captured. It's a trauma so incredibly deep that even generations later, families still struggle to even speak about it.
And we need to be completely honest about the nature of this violence. It was definitely not one-sided. The suffering crossed all religions, all regions, and all borders. What makes this whole thing so uniquely devastating is that the perpetrators and the victims had often known each other for years. Peaceful, beautifully mixed neighborhoods transformed into epicenters of sheer fear. People who had shared weddings, festivals, and run businesses together for generations just suddenly turned on one another. Literally, neighbors killing neighbors.
To really wrap your head around the sheer scale of this displacement, just consider this single number, 800,000. At one point, there was a single, massive refugee column walking across Punjab that swelled to roughly 800,000 people. It was literally a human river moving slowly across the landscape, stretching longer than the entire distance between the cities of Lahore and Delhi. Imagine just standing on a hill and seeing families stretching way beyond the horizon in both directions, all battling disease, running out of food, and dealing with the terrifying reality of losing their children in the massive crowd.
This physical transformation of the land was just absolute. Take Lahore and Amritsar. They're twin cities, separated by only about 50 kilometers, deeply connected by history and trade for ages. Within weeks, both of them were completely unrecognizable. Sikhs and Hindus who had lived in Lahore for centuries fled. Muslims who had lived in Amritsar for centuries fled. The physical buildings, the mosques, the temples, the shops, they survived. But the entire community worlds that lived inside them, their shared languages, memories, and relationships, obliterated overnight.
So what does this all mean for the world right now? Well, that hastily drawn pencil line left a massive geopolitical legacy that absolutely still impacts the world we live in today. Both countries basically built themselves upon the immense grief of what was left behind, and that grief really shaped their futures. Unresolved, messy disputes like Kashmir led to decades of ongoing conflict. It fundamentally shaped national identities, with Pakistan carrying Muslim nationhood and India wrestling with secularism in a highly diverse society. And today, cities that were once part of the exact same shared civilization now face off across heavily guarded, tense frontiers, with nuclear weapons literally standing on both sides.
But you know, beneath all that macro-level geopolitics, beneath the heavily guarded borders and the nuclear weapons, the truest legacy actually lives in ordinary families. Even today, decades later, the events of August 1947 are an active inheritance. There are millions of people out there passing down the exact addresses of a specific street in Lahore or a little market in Delhi, places they can never ever visit. They still literally carry the physical keys to doors they locked back in 1947 because they fully believed they'd return in just a few weeks once the madness stopped.
Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer, and it's a profound one. Partition wasn't just a historical event, it was a wound. Millions of completely ordinary people paid the ultimate price for decisions made way faster than history could ever safely absorb. This whole thing is a story about people who somehow survived a trauma that was built right into their nation's very foundation. And that leaves us with a pretty haunting question to reflect on. How do nations truly heal a wound when the borders that define them are drawn right through the center of it?